Thanks so much, Irene, and welcome to everybody. Thank you all for joining us for this event this evening. My name is Ash. I use he and they pronouns. And I'm gonna just reiterate what Irene mentioned about some of the access notes for this evening's panel. At the bottom of the screen for live captioning, if you click the button at the bottom, you'll be able to get the captioning available to you. Again, if you want access to interpretation, Irene will be on the interpretation line at the bottom of the screen as well. And please, throughout the panel, folks ask questions. We're going to have a Q&A portion and use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen as well. And I'm going to pass it to one of the organizers of tonight's event named Katrina Fid. And Katrina is an organizer, an activist, serving as the communications and digital strategy manager at Chicago Votes. She began organizing around issues of educational equity and inclusive curriculums. Since moving to Chicago, she's focused her organizing on dismantling systems of incarceration and building a more inclusive democracy. She served as co-president of Students Against Incarceration, as a member of the Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois, and has organized with Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, Black Lives Matter St. Paul, and Curriculum on Race and Education. And I'm gonna pass it to Katrina to sort of set the stage for this panel tonight.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Again, I am Katrina Fid, and I joined the Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois back in 2020 when it was called the End Illinois Prison Lockdown Coalition. The End Illinois Prison Lockdown Coalition was formed in direct response to COVID-19 in Illinois prisons and the incredibly failed response on behalf of the Illinois Department of Corrections. For roughly a year in 2020, community members incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections were under an extreme and unending lockdown. Months without movement, inconsistent and punitive protocols, and extremely limited access to communication with loved ones have had detrimental impacts on the physical and mental well-being of those in the Illinois Department of Corrections, while also failing to adequately protect them and their loved ones from COVID-19. And it did not need to be this way. As stated, IDOC placed all facilities on an indefinite lockdown. Our incarcerated community members were confined to their cells, which are roughly the size of a parking space, often with 2 people, and they were forced to stay there for nearly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was irrational, is irrational, and was shown to be ineffective. While IDOC refused to restore basic human rights like access to movement, the law library, commissary, and more, it also failed to implement a range of other simple health protocols. Throughout the pandemic, staff at many facilities walked around without masks, not washing their hands or using hand sanitizer regularly. They used the same carts when transporting food, laundry, and garbage without being cleaned. And the prisons have not consistently provided adequate amount of soap or cleaning supplies. Prisons have also continued to move people around into new cells with new cellmates, destabilizing small groups that have already been proven to be safe, and have put people together in large groups in places like showers and bullpens. Hundreds of people have died, thousands have gotten sick, and much has not changed since then. This is what the End Illinois Prison Lockdown Coalition was born out of. After a year of organizing direct actions, trainings, and fighting for the physical and mental health of our community members in prison, we came to the conclusion that our work was far from over. Though the lockdowns have eased, in-person visits have been restored to some regularity, and programming has somewhat returned, the overall cruelty of prisons remain. As the Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois, we remain committed to educating people on prison issues and fighting for the rights and dignity of incarcerated people and their loved ones. So now that you have an understanding of the crisis in our prisons and our coalition, I'm going to show a brief video to give you a better understanding of our work. This video was produced by Soapbox Productions. It's about 1 minute and 34 seconds, so I will be playing that.
best friend spent this Thanksgiving fighting COVID after being exposed by one of his cellmates. He told me what he has seen and experienced regarding the treatment of those with COVID he will never forget.
The conditions are deplorable. Locking inmates in their cells is not the solution.
The deaths and rapid spread of the virus could have been prevented.
We had a lifetime still left to live together.
What more will it take for policymakers to start caring about COVID in Illinois prisons?
Where are you, Governor Pritzker? We are the End Illinois Prison Lockdown Coalition.
We took up the street for 10 minutes to represent the 10 months Illinois prison have been on lockdown.
We demand you end this torturous lockdown. It is killing people.
With additional coronavirus relief funds,
Where are you, Governor Pritzker?
we extended our reach and assisted even more families.
I see you every day telling the people of Illinois how much you care about them.
Your health and safety is my paramount concern.
Keeping incarcerated people safe is part of that responsibility.
Pritzker is hiding while people are dying.
We want a plan to end the lockdown and a plan that protects the physical and mental health of our loved ones in IDOs. Thank you. Okay, so now that you guys have a little bit of a better understanding of the work that we do, I am going to dive into the report that we put together, which is part of the reason you all are here, and give some background on the report as well. So let me share that now. All right, so the report that the coalition has put together is titled The Culture of Disposability, COVID-19 Conditions in Illinois Prisons. So I just gave you some background on the coalition. Now I'll give you some background on the survey. So in March of 2021, the coalition sent out a survey on COVID-19 conditions to roughly 800 incarcerated people throughout all of the prisons in Illinois. It was sent out in two parts through GTL, which is the Illinois prisons like form of email. And we received roughly 300 responses. So that was a great return rate. And this report is made up of their responses directly. So up here, you can see some really startling statistics. So 2/3 of people that were surveyed said that officers or correctional officers did not mask all the time when near them. Another 1/3 of people incarcerated in Illinois prisons knew someone personally who died in IDOC from COVID-19. And I'll share some of these quotes. Also, this report is available on our website and we'll be making it available to you as well. So you can read through all the quotes, but one of them is, they're still packing us into bullpens like sardines. They do not social distance us when they are holding us in bullpens. The cell house bullpens are almost as big as our cells and they tend to pack about 18 to 12 inmates in a small bullpen. Another person said, we are not even tested for the virus until about 10 months into the pandemic. I got sick twice. Again, testing wasn't regular. They had weird requirements to get a test in the beginning as well. 1/5 of people who needed medication did not have access to the medication at the time survey was needed. That's horrible and life-threatening in itself. 1/3 of people incarcerated during COVID-19 did not have access to mental health assistance when they needed it. And of course, this is incredibly important, especially when you're in a carceral institution, on top of that, dealing with a pandemic and you're locked in a cell, being abused and witnessing death of your friends. So the discussion is kind of the bigger part, and that will lead us directly into the panel. But from the data and the results, we've basically learned that IDOC and Illinois prisons are not capable of protecting people in their custody, nor were prisons designed to protect people from a pandemic in their nature. A lot of the practices of IDOC have been extremely punitive. So we have systemic abuse in terms of punitive policies, and then interpersonal abuse in terms of the harassment incarcerated people have shared that they have received from correctional officers. So in general, the coalition is asking for mass release because we know that prisons are not places of care, but mass release is, again, a very large demand. So in the meantime, we want the Illinois Department of Corrections to be taking the necessary actions recommended by health professionals to protect people in their custody and restore and protect the dignity and rights of each individual in their custody. So now I will stop sharing, and I am going to pass it off to Ash, who is our moderator. Ash is a postdoc scholar in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC, focusing his work on policing and surveillance of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks from an abolitionist perspective. He is organized with various groups to support people who are incarcerated and their loved ones, such as Love and Protect, the Chicago Community Bond Fund, and the New York City chapter of Survived and Punished. They are also a co-founding member of the student-led Abolition at UIC Collective and a board member of the Transformative Justice Law Project, which consists of a group of radical activists, legal workers, and organizers who provide support and free and holistic criminal legal services to poor and street-based trans people in Illinois. So I will now pass it off to Ash.
Thanks so much, Katrina. And also thank you to folks in the coalition for bringing in the voices of our folks on the inside, especially as they're currently facing still the impacts of COVID-19 while being incarcerated. And so before I move forward, I also want to say thank you to Sabrina, our ASL interpreter. I forgot to say that earlier, but thank you so much for your labor for this event. So COVID-19, behind prison walls, a culture of disposability. We have an amazing panel. I'm going to read their bios before we get into some of the questions that we have for them. And then we'll also have a question and answer portion at the end, a Q&A. But I'm going to start with Tewkunzi Green. And so Tewkunzi is a community leader and activist. And through her personal outreach work, Tewkunzi helps families of incarcerated individuals navigate the prison system and the process of release, providing crucial support and knowledge to vulnerable individuals. A former client of Illinois Prison Project, Tewkunzi's sentence was commuted by Governor Pritzker, leading to her release in November of 2020. During her 12 years in prison, Tewkunzi worked in the visiting room where she used her interpersonal skills to navigate complex emotional visitations. Tewkunzi focuses on educating and advocating for families of incarcerated people, and she has also become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, including with the group Love and Protect. After her release, she joined the Illinois Prison Project as a community educator, teaching the loved ones of incarcerated people about their rights. Our next panelist is Erica Miners. And Erica is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies and education at Northeastern Illinois University. As a Barnard J. Brommel Distinguished Research Professor, she teaches classes in justice studies, women's and gender studies, and educational studies. She is the author and editor of a number of books, including Right to be Hostile, Schools, Prisons, and the Making of Public Enemies. Also The Long Term, Resisting Long Sentences, Working Towards Freedom. And also the book that recently came out, Abolition, Feminism Now. Most importantly, Erica has collaboratively started and works alongside others on a range of ongoing mobilizations for liberation, particularly movements that involve access to free public education for all, including people during and after incarceration and other queer abolitionist struggles. She's also a member of the Illinois Death in Custody Project, the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project, the Sister Jean Adult High School, and Critical Resistance and other networks. Our next panelist is Michelle Daniel Jones. Michelle is ABD, all but dissertation, as a fourth-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University. Michelle's dissertation focuses on creative liberation strategies of incarcerated people. And as an organizer, collaborator, and subject matter expert, she creates opportunities to speak truth to power and serves in the development and operation of task forces and initiatives to reduce harm and end mass incarceration. She has joined Second Chance Educational Alliance as a senior research consultant, also the Survivors Justice Project, and serves on the board of Worth Rises and Correctional Association of New York, and advisory boards of the Jami Sisterhood, the Education Trust, A Touch of Light, Urban Institute, and Ithaca's Higher Ed and Prison Project. She's also a board president of Constructing Our Future, which is a housing organization created by incarcerated women in Indiana. She's had several fellowships, including Beyond the Bars, Chris Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, Ford Foundation Bearing Witness with Art for Justice, and several others. And Michelle is currently publishing with the New Press, A History of Indiana's Carceral Institutions for Women, along with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated colleagues. She's also an artist. She also finds ways to funnel her research into theater and dance and photography, including in the co-authored play, The Duchess of Stringtown, which was produced in 2017 in Indianapolis and New York. Another panelist that we have tonight is Alan Mills. And Alan is the executive director of Uptown People's Law Center, which is a nonprofit community legal clinic located on the north side of Chicago. Uptown People's Law Center is a legal organization that fights for justice for tenants, for people with disabilities, and for prisoners in Illinois. He began as a volunteer law student in 1979. Alan has tried dozens of individual cases on behalf of prisoners in state and federal court during the last 40 years. And Uptown People's Law Center is currently lead counsel in 5 class action cases alleging that Illinois prisons violate the constitutional rights of Illinois prisoners. And these include claims that the medical and mental health care provided to prisoners violates the 8th Amendment, prohibition against cruel and unusual treatment, the state's failure to accommodate the communication needs of deaf and hard of hearing prisoners, a claim that hundreds of guards use excessive force during a series of shakedowns, and a case challenging the excessive use of segregation in Illinois prisons. Alan graduated from Northwestern University of Law in 1981, and since 2005, he served as an adjunct professor teaching a seminar on prisons and prisoners' rights. He also trains attorneys and represents prisoners in civil rights cases by the district courts of the Northern and Southern Illinois. And so that is our panel. You can hear everyone has been super busy doing great work. And so I want to get into the questions, but first, thank you all for being here. And I think I want to ask the first question just to the group. So whoever wants to chime in, feel free to. But again, the title of the event tonight is COVID-19 Behind Prison Walls, A Culture of Disposability. And so the first question is, what impact has COVID-19 had on people incarcerated from your perspective?
Well, I don't know. Are you targeting folks or you just want folks to jump in?
this one's for anyone. So Michelle, it's on you.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'm sure everyone else will add on a bit more. From my personal experience, it's just increased the overall suffering of incarceration, as incarceration is already a hard experience to endure. When you add in the forced and long seclusions on the housing units, limiting access to toilets and bathrooms in the summer months, and keeping people in cells that don't have access to air conditioning, you just increase the overall suffering of a human being that is already suffering in incarceration. And I'll keep it short and sweet because I want to leave space for other people to talk about. But short and sweet, it just increases the overall suffering.
I would like to say something. With that, she's correct about that. We had, by me being formerly incarcerated, a lot of people was limited to a lot of things. And when you have officers sitting at the end of the hallway, directing your every move and keeping you bunching the move, you're limited to air, having access to air. You can't go out the building. You can't hardly go out your room. Even if you let the window up, it's barely enough for 4 people in one room, or 2 people in a room, depending on how small those rooms are. It's kind of hard to fight that. And then when you're in a room, you don't know if you want to wear your mask or not, because you are told to wear those masks the entire time and not knowing how this COVID will be spreading. So that's one of the things that I have learned, that it was really tough trying to wear a mask when it all first happening, and standing in a packed room with, packed boxes and, beds and, people got clothes in there, and then trying to go take a shower or go use the restroom down the hallway or wherever the case may be. It's everywhere, and the supplies was limited. So that is a big major problem, is not having enough access to air, like air conditioning and stuff like that.
I guess I would just, I affirm everything that has been said so far. I just want to focus a little bit on, because it's one of the litigation cases we have, is the impact on people who have a serious mental illness. As bad as it's been for everybody, it's been far, far worse for those folks. It's well established that just solitary alone is worse for people with serious mental illness. But on top of that, rather than what you would think would happen, which would be the department would put a lot more resources into mental health care because so many people are stressed, in fact, what they did is virtually eliminate mental health care, including for those most ill people who are in, even those who are in the residential treatment units, the specialized treatment units, are now getting essentially no mental health care. They're still getting their medication, so they haven't cut all that off. But what used to be 2 or 3 groups that people would go to regularly have been eliminated. It's none. Instead, you get somebody stopping by the front of your cell saying, "Are you okay today?" If they say yeah, if somebody says yes, they just move on. There's no engagement, no attempt to see what's really going on with somebody. And of course, as you just said, if you're in a cell with 4 other people, or 3 other people, that is not the time that you're going to open up to a mental health professional and talk about all the problems you have in front of all those people. So there's zero confidentiality, let alone the guard that's standing 3 feet away from the mental health person outside. There's no confidentiality, there's no real treatment. And I can only say that those folks are suffering even more than everybody else is suffering. I don't want to minimize the suffering of everybody because they're suffering. But those people who start off with a mental illness have really deteriorated. And unfortunately, in addition to the deaths that we count as COVID deaths, there have been a couple of suicides. I think clearly because of the lack of mental health treatment for people who are in severe distress.
I just want to, again, actually first start by just honoring, it's really humbling to be here with these fabulous panelists, but also to thank all the people that pulled this conversation together today. And just to lift up the organizations that are both represented on this call, Mourning Our Losses, the Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois, Uptown People's Law Center, Love and Protect. The fact that we know what's happening inside, or we have snippets, it's largely because of the organizing of these networks. So I just want to have gratitude for that work and those organizations. I also just want to acknowledge spend some special care to anybody who might be listening, who's struggling with grief and loss. We stand with you, we support you, you're not alone. I just want to flag that. I want to just offer 2 additions to the fabulous comments that folks have already made. One, I want to just remind us or bring into the room that prisons have always been a pandemic. And I want to kind of that theme about organizing, just amplify the amazing work that's been happening inside and outside in this moment of crisis. So just on that theme of prisons have always been a pandemic. They've always been sites of premature death. Inadequate, or I think that's probably even a paltry word to use, inadequate access to healthcare, horrific conditions, sites of gender and sexual violence. In Illinois, 80 to 100 people, before the pandemic die in prisons every year. And unlike in other nation states where there's some semblance of a mandated inquest, we can debate whether those are effective or not. There's no requirement for that in the state of Illinois. And we did just, pass legislation, the Reporting Deaths in Custody Act here in Illinois, but it doesn't have a lot of teeth, and it mandates things like families should be notified or loved ones should be notified if somebody dies inside. So I wanted to just name that prisons, have always been a pandemic, just so that we, of course, we want to be paying attention to what's happening under COVID, but we don't want to exceptionalize COVID too much. I think COVID has honed a spotlight on the complicity of the state to confer premature death, but premature death doesn't start or stop with COVID. So I just want to bring that into the room because I think that's really important, because these moments of crisis are both opportunities to see the fault lines of the state and the violence of the state in sharp visibility, but they're also opportunities for the state to consolidate power, double down, right? And I think we want to pay attention to that. And the second thing I wanted to flag, in addition to sort of prisons as always being a pandemic, is I just want to, again, just as I did in my little quick intro, just really amplify the amazing inside outside work, the report that this webinar led off with. The brilliant work that people inside and outside are doing. And again, this is not new. I think of the amazing work in Bedford Hills during the HIV crisis, where people inside were doing peer-to-peer education, were supporting one another. The state didn't care. So I think it's not a new thing by any means, but I just want to lift up the really strong work, whether it's outside organizations fundraising so that masks and hand sanitizer can be made available to the Department of Corrections, but potable water is dropped off at prisons. And this is the work of our work, the work of organizations and networks that are hustling, so I wanted to just flag at the start, both prisons are always have always been a pandemic. COVID is, forcing us to pay attention in a different kind of way. And I also wanted to just remind us of the resistance and the organizing and the networking also in this moment. So thanks.
Thank you all for really diving into that first question. And Erica, you started to really get into some specific prisons here in Illinois. And I wanted to just ask you, Tewkunzi, if you had any more you wanted to share specifically around Logan. For folks who aren't familiar, Logan is one of the women's prisons here in Illinois. And so I just wanted to just take a moment in case you wanted to share a little bit more about your experience and the experience of your folks also inside there at Logan and what you all were seeing.
Thank you so much. It was just, when it first all happened, it was unbelievable. People reacted real differently, as if they didn't know what to expect. We all didn't know what to expect the first moment it came through. It was so hard for people to stay in their rooms. It was so hard for people to understand the process. That's the first thing. you know, when you have people passing out masks and 1 bar of soap, I think we probably got 2 bars of soap per week. But the thing is, people didn't understand the danger that, was coming towards us, and trying to help other people stay focused and say, hey, this is not us, let's work together as a team. Let's get going, because we can only, keep ourselves safe. Nobody else can keep us safe. They started off real good with bringing cleaning supplies and masks, soap on the unit daily, keeping the phone sprayed. It was a lot of things was accomplished at first, but the more the months started passing by, it's like it was getting ridiculous. Like, people start catching it, and people don't know how they caught it, especially if you've been in the room the whole entire time. They don't know how they caught it. So, and then if you see an officer not wearing his or her mask, that become a problem, because hey, here it go again. You was out in the outside world, and you coming in, we don't know if you have it, because at the time it wasn't nothing that had to do with vaccination shots. So we was accepting to a lot of things that we shouldn't been, and we was exposed to it. So it became hard when people was like, well, I want to call my family. Well, that was a no-no at time, when people cannot call their family. You have people who couldn't shop, everything was limited. And it became a big part, because if you go outside the door, especially if you had a legal call, you had to wear your mask, and the officer had to escort you somewhere. So everybody felt like this was real prison when they did this. And I told them, you cannot blame the people for something that had actually turned the world upside down. And that was a big fault, because when you go to the bathroom was getting barely clean. So there it goes, spreading more germs, more bacteria, virus, everything is built on base. So that was another hardship. Told when you could take your shower, and people's getting upset. And then if you even sneeze, they say you had COVID. So now you go to a unit that never been clean, and you are locked away from other people on a unit by yourself, with which a nurse would barely come and check on you to see if you are okay. So some of the things that Erica was talking about early is some of the things that we was experienced at the beginning of COVID, without, people saying like, like they barely wearing their mask, they wear it halfway down. The officer, if the individuals that was incarcerated didn't wear their mask properly, you're going to write us a ticket or whatever. So how can you lead someone through that way if you're not properly wearing yours? So it was a lot of things that people was fighting. And even what Alan was talking about, for those that have mental issues going on, it was a problem, because they barely had a window to look out. So they're in a room individual by themselves, can't clean up the room. Nobody can come and clean their room up. So it was a lot going on, that it was throwing the prison up in an uproar, and people did not know how to accept being in an enclosed environment, which some people became claustrophobic because they so used to moving around. And when you sit in this very tight space, everybody's going to have a problem. Then you got fights breaking out. Then you got people want to argue with the officer. People could not get along at the time. So it had made a big problem. Just the word COVID itself, because nobody didn't know what it means. We watched CNN, we watched the news, but we wasn't getting enough information within the prison on COVID and what this virus does, and how does it come by, what causes it. Nobody didn't know. We didn't even know how to treat it. People didn't know if we should drink tea, if we should just constantly drink water. It was a whole lot of things. So it took itself for a whirlwind, and it was just so erratic, just to see how people were just going up in flame in the prison, because you got people who wanted to know more information versus those who didn't care and just felt like the people was trying to keep them from going outside, or people from keeping them from doing that daily activities that we was doing. So it really had affected us, and it affected a lot of families, because then you get all these people who sick, especially people who had asthma. Healthcare couldn't help you. You go over there, they tell you get on a breathing machine. Well, who knows how many people been on that breathing machine before I got on it to, get my own breathing treatment. So those are things that when you look at prison, the Medicare, the healthcare part wasn't strongly helping us. And that's what caused more, because people didn't know every time that a symptom come, is it COVID? We didn't know that part. So when we see these rising deaths on CNN or some other places, we like, oh, we praying, oh, I hope we don't get it next. Then here go people coming in from the county jail who's already exposed to society, who's coming in. It was just so irritating, because we don't know if they're going to put that person on the unit, or is we going to get exposed to it if we had an empty bed in our room and they bringing new people up in here. It's like it was a whole bunch of things that had your mind wondering if we're going to be able to survive doing this the whole entire time. And before I got out, it was like people didn't care, because the officer didn't care. And that's what made a big part of people really saying, like, if they don't care, we don't care. I said, no, that's not the way you should act, because if something happened, your family gonna fall, IDOC, like, help yourself, like, let's not go through this. And I remember I had a headache, and first thing somebody said, oh, you got COVID. Like, that don't mean that you have COVID because you have a headache, but some of the symptoms that contain was headache was one of, loss of sense, loss of taste and all this stuff. And I didn't have no idea what it was until one person did get sick, and she did not want to go to the healthcare because she said they're gonna let me die. That make you feel in the inside like your whole heart just dropped, because you never know if this person gonna live. But she lived through it. When I end up on the phone, I think it was my mom. She told me, drink some hot, just keep drinking some hot, drink some hot tea. I know you got tea in your box. And I'm like, yeah, keep plenty of tea. She was like, give her some. And the more the girl was drinking, the more she was throwing, up everything, and she started feeling better. And I was like, you okay? And she was like, I hope I'm not exposed to it. Then when she go to healthcare, they tell her she didn't have it. She had food poisoning. So we didn't know the difference in some of the things that was going on. So that was the big change of being away in society, and nobody not giving us enough information. We didn't get no information on another understanding in it. We did not get no information on it. All they were telling us is how to protect yourself, wash your hand, clean the doorknob and stuff like that. Like, we needed more information, and that was some of the prison was lacking, that no one was willing to tell us anything. And if you ask a question, you might get yelled at. And I don't think that was fair to a lot of people. And I felt bad for people that was like in segregation, people that was on the mental issues, who, was in rooms to themselves because they was clueless. You're not telling nobody now, even people on ground, going to chow, and, you have to walk 6 feet apart. And it's like, it takes forever to go just to get to get something to eat. And it was kind of crazy. It was like very hectic. And I just couldn't figure out like, what was the whole scenario to getting COVID in prison, and especially with people that had asthma. Like, I was asthmatic. I'm asthmatic. And I always kept myself protected. And I felt so bad. Like, if anything happened to me, will my family ever know? And I did see people, struggling in the infirmity, trying to, live through, and then you don't have ventilators or none of that to protect them in prison from if they, pass away or anything. So after I left, people was passing away in prison, and that was hurting my heart the most, because we don't know if they actually had COVID or people losing oxygen, people not getting I'm just put like this. People are not getting the care that they should get. And that was a hurtful feeling because, I hear it all the time. They making us walk outside to the end of the walk to go get our tray. And, they doing it by rooms and I'm like, are they? And they like, yeah. And they take a COVID test every other day or something like that. And that's saying they take that swab, you automatically got COVID and you don't even know how you got it because the person you been in the room with, nobody got it, but you got it all of a sudden and you ain't been around nobody but the people in your room. So a lot of that is what make it so hard to understand COVID when you're in that predicament. And for the people that don't care about those that's in there, like the officers, they make it hard for them. And that's what made me feel less of a person because they didn't understand what we was going through, how it was impacting us at that time while we was in that predicament, trying to wear a mask. And, if we trying to speak to them, oh, put your mask, but he's not got his mask on. And, it's just the little things like that did matter, that hurt it, like not having enough bleach or disinfectant spray. All that matters. And that's the best I can say. It was a destruction. It was a war for a minute, just not, for being unsafe.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that really full, obviously unfortunate and picture. And also just good to hear that the person you were referencing made it and they're still with us. I want to pull out, this is a question I want to ask you, Michelle, to begin with, because Tewkunzi, you talked a lot about the impacts on family members. And I know, Michelle, you're not in Illinois, I believe, but you do, I know you're writing a book with and still organized with and are constant communication with folks on the inside. But specifically, I'm curious if you could speak to a little bit about how COVID and the pandemic and the impacts on people who are incarcerated have affected also like family members and loved ones of our folks too.
Right. So in my bio, I didn't mention, I need to update it, that I was one of the original groups who helped form MOL. I don't run it, but I am a part of that group of people who, after March 5th, we sent our first letter to the governor saying, based on our lived experience of incarceration and what we know about what it means to be inside, we are concerned that there will be people dying in droves in incarceration, and you need to decarcerate. The governor ignored us, and that's one of the reasons why MOL was born. MOL was created to memorialize deaths that we knew would inevitably come based on the conditions of confinement inside. And why do I know that? Because I remember the trauma that we suffered under that forced lockdown when the facility moved from one location to another location, and how hard it was living in confinement in those cells. I remember the lockdown, the many weeks lockdown, when the major committed suicide on the grounds and what that was like. I said, if you add a pandemic to a lockdown, a long-term lockdown situation, and it is a contagious disease, we were extremely worried that people would begin dying in droves. One of the things that came out of this push was an emergency plan. We knew that we needed, in order to make an argument for the governor, that we needed to create a plan that would have built into it resources to put people coming out of incarceration in. Our plan was to decarcerate the facility from anyone serving less than 365 days and anybody with a life-threatening disease and anybody over 70. And of course, none of that was accepted by the governor. So we ended up trying to find individual lawyers who would have filed sentence modifications for specific people. Because the reality is that we knew that what became with COVID in these facilities would become that. I could see it, even though I wasn't incarcerated at the time, I could see it coming. Okay, so what we began to do then is organize amongst ourselves to raise issues and awareness across the country. It was a really powerful moment across the country when the Slack channel Justice Hub was created. It became a ready resource for people all across the country to share information about what was happening in COVID-19 around the country and advocacy happening on the ground. We were heavily involved in that, and we shared information and shared what we had, and so that others could share with us. To that end, when it became time to launch a campaign against the conditions of confinement in the middle of summer, when women were boiling inside the facility, where staff were fainting on the job because they closed COVID up in these dorms without ventilation. You know, we had a community of people to support us in our campaign. We did press coverage, and we actually held some webinars and Zoom conversations to educate the community about what was happening with COVID-19. So much so that now, and I'm not going to go into details about how I know what I know, how I know that the women are currently locked down again due to a surge that's happening. That is happening in the Indiana Women's Prison and other facilities. Now you ask yourself, well, why is this happening? If people have spent 2 years learning about the pandemic, educating people about the pandemic, it is quite simply because they have politicized testing and politicized vaccination and politicized the wearing of masks to the point where staff are not required to wear their masks. Because women are not required to wear the mask. Nobody's required to get vaccinated. Nobody's required to be tested. So if you see out in the world that we are going up with the Omicron infectious rate, it is not without a doubt that is also happening in prisons across the country and in the state of Indiana and Illinois, because they are not testing regularly. And they're not increasing the testing of staff. So say you get a baseline where you get a couple housing units where you've not seen COVID-19 over several weeks or several months, and then out of nowhere, COVID-19 pops up. 9 times out of 10, it's because a correctional officer or staff member has brought it onto the housing unit. But because there's no mandate for testing, people are allowed to walk around into this facility and keep reinfecting this population that you are not providing services to keep them safe from the get-go. So what you have made is the lockdown more than punitive. You have made it a cesspool, a contagious cesspool for women and men. And so the trigger when COVID-19 infectious rates increases is to lock everybody down with the idea that you're going to be able to get a handle on it. But what you're doing is you're closing it in. And there's the whole idea that, well, you'll survive it. You just need to survive it. You just need to just figure out how to survive under this, right? But prisons are not built for crisis. Prisons are not built to handle. Prisons aren't meant to handle much of anything, but they certainly are not meant to handle crises where people need to have a rapid response. My last comment about this whole entire thing is that if the government is willing to roll out a massive campaign to mail at-home test COVID-19 kits to families across the country, why then are not these same tests made available to incarcerated women and men across the country who are being forced to live under a confined cesspool of semi-permanent or permanent lockdown? If we allow them the right to test themselves as we are all allowed to test ourselves, we will be better able to put people together and segregate people who have the who have COVID-19, so that they're not reinfecting everybody. As long as we walk around in this abyss, as Tewkunzi said, we don't know who got what, when, and where. As long as we allow that, we will continue to be putting a bunch of people at higher risk for infection and death, and they weren't incarcerated for that. Nobody was incarcerated to be put on a path towards death. But that's exactly what we're doing when we do not mandate, push people, allow human beings to be tested for COVID-19. And so I agree so much with Alan talked about this whole idea of lack of programming, right? At all my facility in the state of Indiana, they had just got programming back, right? And they hadn't quite gotten to the point where women could visit again, and we're figuring all that out. They had started a little bit of visitation, but now, because they refuse to test and they refuse to allow women the at-home test so they can test themselves, now they're in a precarious situation where they're losing programming that they so desperately need. I needed my programming for my survival in incarceration, for my mental health, my mental and emotional and spiritual health. I needed my church services. I needed my group therapy. I needed my education, higher education. I needed these things. They weren't options for me. It's how I survived 20 years of incarceration. So instead of having a plan that preserves a population from infection by consistent testing, you have cut off their lifeline again. And that right there is one of the highest forms of disregard for human life. That's all I'm saying.
Yes. Thank you so much, Michelle. Just taking a minute to sit with all that you just said. Yeah. I want to also make sure that we get a chance to get to some of the Q&A questions, but I do want to maybe try to fit one more in, and then I'll try to get to some of those as well. And so this one is attached to some of what you were saying about like resistance. So I know, again, many of you are doing a lot of organizing and support work with people who are incarcerated. And so this is sort of a two-part question. Wondering what resistance surrounding COVID-19 has been looking like in the different locations and prisons and places we're talking about. And that's the first part. And then the second part is about people taking action. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A about action, but I can reiterate that one again, which is how can we encourage people to take some action around all of the stuff you've been talking about? But yeah, what is resistance looking like amongst your different groups and organizations and incarcerated folks? So that's for anyone, but Erica, if you wouldn't mind starting, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I think we just had two fabulous testimonies about, examples of resistance, both inside and outside and inside-outside networks. So I just want to underscore, both of those, testimonies. And I also just want to amplify what's going on in the chat. Like lots of people are sharing reports about what's happening in a range of kinds of prisons and support for one another. So I just want to encourage people to continue to share that work in the chat. And I also want to just lift up the report that was presented again at the beginning of this conversation as a really great, comprehensive attempt to sort of give us more of a wider snapshot about what's happening in Illinois. I also want to just remind us that prisons and the criminal legal system aren't broken, that they're working precisely as designed, which is, again, to sort of facilitate premature death. I think the crisis of COVID allows us to see really nakedly that the state is killing people. I mean, as Michelle just so beautifully outlined, there are things the state could have done, right? Furloughs, Canada furloughed people, right? Even people with so-called violent offenses, right? We could, we had, sentencing hearings during COVID for both Erica Ray and Daryl Fair, right? Who'd served decades already, and the state decided not to release those people, right? We could, have had mass clemency. We could have, had a whole host of kinds of initiatives, and very predictably, the state, and I'm using that kind of in a generalizing way, didn't do any of those things. So I just want to kind of, not to be fatalistic, but I think that, we need to sort of remind ourselves that, COVID is not showing that the prison system is broken, right? But rather it's working exactly as it, has always been working, right? But I think we are also working as we have been working as this panel is sort of amplifying. People inside are sharing information about conditions. They're making sure that loved ones on the outside know when stuff goes down, when people are ill. They're making sure they're the ones trying to get medical attention for people who are ill inside. They're the ones trying to let people know that, for example, at Stateville Prison, that the water isn't potable right now, right? So I think trying to look at already existing networks, and we mentioned a couple of those at the top of the call: Love and Protect, Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois, Parole Illinois. Alan is here, our fabulous lawyer for many decades, right, who's been working around health issues in the Department of Corrections. So I think that we do have these already existing networks that are really important to support, to use to share information, and they're inside outside networks. And I think we have to deepen those, continue to lean into those. And those are organizations that have zero cash often, right? There are small groups of people that are hustling, so I think we need to share their work. And I also just want to lift up independent journalism at this moment, right? Whether it's Truth Out, whether it's Brian Dolinar, hopefully I didn't mispronounce your last name. I apologize if I did. Even WBEZ, maybe they're not that, which is our national public radio here. Shannon Heffernan has been leaning in and really trying to make this an issue and make it visible. So I think we need to be in, continually in a state of permanent organization and doing this work, and which, all of our fabulous panelists already, and try to take joy, and also, the heaviness of the work, but also joy. I was just remembering the car caravan that went around Stateville, the first April of the pandemic, this enormous, organized by many people who are on this call, the enormous footprint of that prison. I think it was the first time I'd ever driven all the way around it. It is freaking enormous, right? But there was music, there were family members testifying, there were formerly incarcerated women who were, giving testimony, even though it was a men's prison. There was music, there was a religious person who was offering a sermon. There was a big speakers on cars. That was both a joyous event and also a heavy event. But I think we want to try to continue that kind of work. So that's a little bit. Ash, your question is super important. How do we stay organized? How do we stay connected? So I'm saying, get involved, right? Pay attention to non-mainstream media outlets, right? Challenge this narrative that that this is sort of an exceptional moment. I think we need to do the both and here, recognize that it is exceptional, it's a pandemic, but also this is business as usual for the criminal legal system. So I'll pivot to someone else now.
And really quick, I'll just add on to that. One of the things that I saw that's been very impactful is narrative sharing, and women and men writing their stories and are producing artwork. That's what's happening with the MOL. People are memorializing people through pencil drawings and other art. One of the things that was helpful for us is to get correctional officers to speak to us. And that's one of those ways in which, of course, anonymously, but we were very helpful for those tweets and those inside information from correctional officers who felt like it was inappropriate what was happening. Again, I agree with the articles. We got a great group called at the public television at WFYN here in Indianapolis, Jake and Lauren, who produced a podcast called Sick. And this podcast went into depth about what was happening at the women's prison and other facilities. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that one of the things that we did in the last year is that we met with incoming correctional healthcare workers, because they often live with an automatic tension to take care of human beings, but there's a correctional mandate and ideology that does not support care. So one of the things that we did is we met with these interns going in and said, hey, what is your orientation and belief about these human beings that you're going to meet in here? And if it's an orientation that believes that sees these people being less than human, we would ask you to reflect on that and change that consciousness and go in there mandating that these people have a right to care. Like every human, because I'll ask you this about your mother. Do you believe your mother has a right to care? They'll say yes, or the cousin, or yes, or da. Well, anybody in prison was not sentenced to death and from the lack of health care. So you have a mandate to go in there and treat them that way. And that was pretty transformational because they had no idea of what correctional healthcare looked like. They thought they were going in to be healthcare workers, but it's certainly a different thing because there's an active work at denying care in the correctional setting. And so those kinds of resistances are great. And then of course, on the legislative level, we need to push our legislatures and to offer in-home personal testing for people in prison and push for that, to allow those people to test themselves. They're human beings, adult folks, and they can handle this. And then have a response for positive tests that don't leave everyone in the cesspool, and increase tests and fight for testing, increase testing for staff and correctional officers. It's an absolute must. But those are some of the action items that come to mind.
Yeah, I want to build off of that. First of all, a couple facts about Illinois, just so we are all on the same page here. Since this started in March of 2020, there have been over 21,000 prisoners in Illinois who have tested positive for COVID, about 2/3 of the population, which is now just under 30,000 people. Currently, today, there are 3,344 active COVID cases. So about 10% of the population right now, over 10% of the population right now is positive for COVID. That is not evenly spread among the prison system. Some prisons are much, much higher. Robinson and Menard right now are by far the worst, which is interesting because Menard is a high security prison where most people are locked in their cells every day. Robinson is a minimum security prison where people are living in dormitories. Yet they both have somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the prisoners who have been infected in those prisons, which leads me to my main point here, which is it's not a mystery as to how people are getting COVID. They're getting it from the staff that walk through the front door. Unlike all of us out here who interact with a lot of people every day, even if you're trying to isolate, you're still interacting with a lot of people. In prison, it's the one of very few places in society where we have total control over who goes through those prison doors every day. COVID does not jump over the walls. It walks through the front gate. And the people who walk through that front gate every day are guards and medical people and other staff. In Illinois, at the University of Illinois, they started testing everybody, students and staff, 2-3 times a week with rapid tests over a year ago. And if they were tested positive, they isolated them. There's no reason in the world a year ago we couldn't have started testing every person who walked into prison at the front gate, and if they had a positive test, turn around and send them home. Now, why didn't we do that? Partly it's just because we didn't care, and partly it's because of kind of what Erica said is, what that would mean is there'd be a lot of staff who couldn't come to work, and then they wouldn't have enough people, and they have to let people out because they simply wouldn't have enough people to staff the prisons. And that was the last thing they wanted to do, was to actually protect people by letting them go. That is still the demand we ought to be making, is that they test at the front door. Rapid tests are no longer a unique thing at the University of Illinois. You can buy them at Walgreens. All of us can go out and buy a rapid test. I don't have any idea why they are not at the front gate of every prison testing everybody who walks in the door. Is it going to be 100% accurate? No, there are going to be a few cases that sneak through because they do some false negatives. But nonetheless, it would cut it down. You would not have 500 people in a prison all of a sudden getting COVID because somebody walked in and decided, as somebody put in the chat, it's a real thing. Somebody went to a Christmas party where there was no masking, no vaccination, nothing else. And then a whole bunch of guards went to this party and they all got infected and they all went into the prison next day and they all spread it throughout. The other big issue is vaccines, and that goes back to the organizing part of this. You may remember when Illinois started doing vaccinations, prisoners were not on the list at all as to when they would get vaccinated. It was a to be determined. There was a lot of organizing, inside in part, but a lot of organizing the outside to make sure that that vaccine, that prisoners were kicked up high and were put at the same level as everybody else who lived in a congregate setting, who had no choice but to congregate with people every day. And that succeeded. So the next step, though, was to make sure people got it, because unsurprisingly, given how bad medical care is in the prisons, a lot of prisoners didn't trust the Department of Corrections to tell the truth about what these vaccines were. I mean, there's a lot of skepticism on the outside. There's a lot of skepticism among the minority communities throughout as well, because of a history of medical abuse, well-earned skepticism. So a lot of us on the outside, including many people on this call, worked together and got the department to agree to spread our messages into prisoners. Our pamphlets that we put together from medical professionals saying what was going on, our videos that former prisoners who were incarcerated before were willing to say, I got a vaccine. We actually got a movie where somebody was getting vaccinated who had recently gotten out. And they showed that on the video screens inside prison to convince prisoners to get it. And as a result, while the nationwide vaccination rate among prisoners was about 40%, in Illinois, it's now 75% of prisoners are vaccinated, and at least half of those, I believe, is the current figure, have gotten the booster now. So that was a really successful campaign. What has not been so successful is on the staff side. About 40% of staff initially were vaccinated. The governor did announce a mandate saying that they had to get vaccinated, not in Indiana. Indiana is a whole different world. But our nice liberal governor did announce that mandate back in August. We're now sitting here in January, and it has yet to be enforced. Everybody was supposed to be vaccinated by September. There have been all kinds of maneuvering that's going on, but ultimately the governor has said it's the end of January. So about 5 days from now, at least all staff is supposed to have their first shot. Unbelievable that they don't, including a lot of healthcare workers, which shows just what their mentality is. But nonetheless, they're not. But there's going to be big pressure from the union to kick that date further down the road. And I think one of the most important things that people can do on this call is demand and send the message to the governor in particular, who controls this process, hold firm, because he's going to get pressure from the other side. He has to hear pressure from people who care about the prisoners that this mandate has to actually go into effect. There's no reason we should continue to go on without guards being vaccinated, without all medical staff being vaccinated. Everybody who walks to that front door should have to show that little card, just like you do to go to a restaurant in Chicago. You got to show that card to go to a restaurant, for God's sakes. Why don't you have to show it when you walk into a prison to take care of people who have no choice but to hang out with you? Those are my two demands that people should be making. They should be making them to the governor's office, because frankly, nobody else has control over this system other than the governor. He's the one who has the mandate. He's the one who has to deal with the union representing the staff. He's the one who has to hear from people saying, I know you're going to get a lot of pressure from the union, but we want you to know that there are people on the outside who care about this and who insist that you stick to your guns and make sure it's a mandate. And if that means you have to send a whole bunch of guards home on February 1st, great, do it. You have the power to release people. If you don't have enough staff, send people home who should be home. That's my soapbox, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for the soapbox. We appreciate it. There's a lot of questions, and I know we won't be able to get to them all. And you all have answered several of them actually with a lot of action items. And so I do want to maybe again start, if you can, Erica, with this next question. It also relates, there's a question in the Q&A that says, how can we support people inside while we also work to abolish prisons? This is obviously the abolition question. And or another question is, how can you talk a little bit about what impact COVID has had in prisons and the impact that it's had on the prison abolition movement? But of course, anyone can answer, but maybe Erica, if you want to start with this one, and then we can see where we get to.
Oh my God, great questions. I was also just remembering in our last discussion that Stateville Prison, a prison 45 minutes away from Chicago on a good day with little traffic. For 29 years, Stateville Prison was a site where they used people in the prison for malaria testing. Was only removed in 1974, right? in part because the Department of Corrections decided to stop it, not the university-based researcher who was head of that malaria testing for 29 years. So I just want to, when folks are flagging the sort of distrust of the system, and that's just one example of many, many, many examples of the collusion, or the way in which, as the session is titled tonight, people inside are seen as disposable, seen as not fully human. And I think that there's so many examples of that historically and today, but I think it's important to bring up those histories because they inform and shape this moment. So when I was at Stateville Prison in December, in that moment, as Michelle was referencing, when it looked like programming might come back in, it looked like visitations, in-person visitations might come back in. People were, there was a discussion that emerged about vaccine in the classroom, and people were, I was just listening, people were, skeptical. And of course, who wouldn't be skeptical? Who wouldn't incredibly distrust, the system? So I just want to sort of, I was just thinking about that as we were talking. But there's so much to do. And I think, abolitionist work is about the practice, and this panel, has offered so many concrete ways to do the work so that people are safer and more free, sort of harm reduction work, and also have the broader vision, right? I mean, I've been sort of on the theme tonight that prisons have always been a pandemic, just to remind us, because these moments of crisis, Michelle referenced that prisons are, not set up for crisis. And I think that we're at this moment where, where we're sort of seeing the, naked eyes of the state killing people, but it's also, an opportunity for the state to reconfigure. And are we just going to have, virtual visitation from now on? Because under the argument of, there's too much risk in bringing people inside, or we're just going to have online learning, for example, because that's a way to, mitigate risk. Sandra Brown, a wonderful inside outside organizer, said on a call earlier on this week that we gotta keep pressing on. We have to be skeptical of the ways in which the Department of Corrections or the prison tries to, make the argument, that for their frameworks, their logics, their language. So I just want to raise that. It's not an answer to your fabulous question, Ash, but I feel like we've kind of moved around that. But I just want to ask us or invite us all to think about this moment of crisis, as both an opportunity to see, and to really recognize forms of racialized violence, white supremacy, in place in the system, but also kind of a little bit of a worry about how the, what's going to come next. So I think our organizing also has to anticipate what's going to come next, and be ready for that, and work collaboratively to challenge that. So when they come down to us and say, only, online visitation, Maya Chenoir has written beautiful work about this. We don't want just online, virtual visitation. We don't want to just have tablet-based programming, right? And we also don't want to just have, the state decide, that what kind of healthcare is adequate. We want decarceration, we want abolition. So I just want to remind people about that sort of the tense moment that we're in.
Yeah, and I think I would add, just to add to that we need to be willing to ask additional questions and bring them to task. Before this all started, they didn't have a dashboard in our state that showed the number of COVID-19 cases. But because we were raising the questions and we were pushing and we were pressing and we were phone calling and we were making it an issue, there's a dashboard. Okay, so great, we've got a dashboard, but now we have to question the validity and the data of the dashboard. Because if you go to our dashboard today, it'll say that there's over 35,000 people tested, but there is less than 35,000 people in the entire state incarcerated. So you got to question the data, and be willing to ask those questions, and cultivate. What we have done is cultivate those people who have access to resources and authority, because while I'm just Joe Schmo and I don't, and I can't necessarily get the commissioner to respond to me, they might respond to Senator J.D. Ford. They might respond to House Representative Carly Macer or Renee Pack. So cultivate those other people with access to authority to ask the questions that we need asked. Cultivate those relationships so that they are on our side, so that they can be in the front of the fight, along, and then we are providing the support on the streets. I just think it's a way in which to mobilize them. When we start talking about the lack of visitation, the lack of continuity or relationship between mothers and babies, when particularly women who are having children and are not in the We Ones unit, and then get that 24 hours with their baby, and then they got to go back to the prison, and then they can't see their children. When we start bringing those issues before them because of COVID, we can galvanize additional support in places where we don't normally think that we can find that. And I think that that's what we have to be bold enough to do. We need to look for those people who are already impassioned about our work, like Planned Parenthood and ACLU, but then also look for these other people who need to be radicalized. And we need to have our information, we need to have the consciousness, we need to have the data to support the radicalization of people who would not ordinarily be radicalized, and to support them as they step out on a limb for us.
Thank you all so much. Alan or Tewkunzi, did you want to leave us with anything before we exit? Are you all okay? Great. Oh, go ahead, Alan. No, okay. It's Zoom. It's like a little dance we're doing. I don't know. Great, perfect. So I just want to say thank you all again for being on the panel. There was a lot dropped here. There was a lot of I appreciate all of you all's experiences, all the people that you all and everyone who is attending tonight are here, but also the people we're bringing in with this conversation through their voices, through the report, through all of the work that we're all doing. I'm just going to restate two quotes. There were so many. I'm going to say again, prisons are not set up for crisis, also because they are doing exactly what they were intended to do. Thank you, Michelle. And also prisons have always been a pandemic. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Tewkunzi. Thank you, Alan. And I also just want to say a quick thank you as well to our ASL interpreter, Sabrina Boykin, to Irene Hernandez doing Spanish translation. Thank you so much. And also to the co-sponsors, the UIC Criminology Law and Justice Department, and also the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, as well as a special thank you to folks in the Coalition to Decarcerate Illinois, and everybody that you all are probably seeing behind the scenes doing all the tech stuff on the back end as well. Thank you all for being here. That's all I got. Thanks.